Hello, my friends. Today we'll be watching and discussing 3 clips featuring the legend Frank Sinatra.
Fly me to the moon.
We'll understand how he's able to communicate so fluidly with class and sophistication, but also effectively command the attention of those he's speaking to. I'm excited. Let's watch the first clip.
I think I was tired. It's not an excuse, it's a fact. I think I was weary because I had worked tremendously for the years preceding that period, worked constantly, 300 days a year or more in many instances. And I was traveling constantly and just doing all kinds of work. And I had a personal problem, which I will not go into.
Notice his head movements and the way that he communicates. There's almost a subtle relationship between his head movements and the musicality, the melody of his sentences. It's very subtle. Of course, you would expect nothing less from a singer, but his head is almost leading his words in some sense. He also is pivoting, tilting his head ever so slightly to the side. That's typically a sign of engagement in a conversation, but it also is indicative of someone who is comfortable in their environment. They're not so rigid, unyielding, and stiff in their body language that they aren't unwilling to be at least a little bit open. When Frank Sinatra is contemplating his thoughts, I've noticed this in different interviews, but you can see this in this clip we just watched. He raises his head, pivots to the right, looks up ever so slightly, as many of us do when we're trying to recall a memory. And when he wants to be more serious and commanding with his tone, such as when he said,
and I had a personal problem, which I will not go into.
He tucks his chin closer to his neck, and that allows you to achieve a deeper register of your pitch that can underscore what you say with a certain quality of command and seriousness.
When I was ready and I had had enough rest, or I took time to have all of the cobwebs blown out of my head, I went back to work.
One of the qualities of someone who's considered to be an intelligent speaker, and I do consider Frank Sinatra to be one such person, is your ability to package intent with creative language, typically idioms or figures of speech that carry vivid imagery or visuals. This is a lost art in the way that we communicate in society today. We often will say things in the most blunt, bold, and brash way that comes to mind, when in reality, there's a way that you can make the same point, but employ a creative playfulness with your words, typically through the use of idioms, such as what Frank Sinatra said when he made the reference to blowing cobwebs out of his mind. He could have simply said mental clarity, is what many people may say today. And there's nothing wrong with that particular expression, but we do have this over-reliance on cliches and overworked expressions that just aren't indicative of someone who is willing to be more calculated, intentional, and intelligent with their word choice.
Before we get on with the big one, I'd like to take this opportunity to level, you might say, to speak for just a second to us, we in the picture business. I, for one, am frankly a little tired of all of the talk about editorials, quote, what's wrong with Hollywood, unquote.
When he speaks, I notice that there's a lot of hesitation in his sentences, and it's healthy hesitation. It's not hesitation as if he isn't sure about what he wants to say and he can't commit to confidently expressing his views. It's hesitation in the sense of a pause. Dr. Don Kirkley, who is a rhetorician and a professor of communications at the White House, he teaches politicians how to speak persuasively, has this rule where you speak 6 words and then you pause, often just for a second, but it makes all the difference in the receptiveness that your message can have by your listeners. Obama would often speak this way, and I noticed Frank Sinatra employs a very similar pattern. He'll say a few words, and then he'll hesitate. And there's great enunciation in what he says. There's clarity, and that clarity is able to be amplified more by that thinking time that we're able to have as an audience in processing what he says.
I'm sick about hearing of runaway productions and costs and the star system and how we need government subsidies. I know it and you know it, but we need a good pictures. And the way to get good pictures, as I rather obliquely hinted earlier in the evening, is to get back into the Mona Lisa business. Individual pictures, handmade with love and passion and care by individual picture makers. Not by banks or committees or accountants or lawyers or office boys or boards of directors who are really in the real estate business, but by picture makers.
In that sentence, Frank was using a rhetorical device called polysyndeton. It's a Greek word meaning many bound together, and typically it's the practice of when you have a list of places, objects, ideas, as he says, not banks or accountants or boards of directors. What you will do is you will proceed through that list without taking a breath. And it creates an undertone of urgency, almost desperation or insistence that is communicated through the strain of your voice because your audience subconsciously wants you to take a breath. There's that relief that's anticipated. And this allows you to build to this culminating point of tension where when you do take a breath, there is this revitalization and vigor and energy that is often flavoring whatever is said when you take the breath. And we see this with what he says, not by banks or accountants or boards of directors, and there's 6 or 7 other various attributes that he lists, but by motion picture makers or whatever he says. There's that rise. That practice of polysyndeton allows you to build this anticipation so that people are more attuned to receiving whatever often is the solution to the problem that you're addressing. And he does that in this Oscar speech.
Well, what do you regard as the most satisfying thing you've done in all of your show business career?
Well, as I mentioned briefly a minute ago, Ed, I think, first of all, I must preface it by saying that I'm a real stickler for perfection in my work and in most other people's work, too. I find myself picking whatever I do apart, which I do believe is quite healthy. And I found that after seeing The Man with the Golden Arm, I was as contented with that performance as I've been with anything I've ever done in my life, and particularly in the professional world. It gave me a great satisfaction, really.
His word choice reminds me of a vocabulary habit that was quite popular during his time period, where people would take adjectives and they would cushion those adjectives with a certain set of words that would qualify what they wanted to say. Words like tremendously, I'm tremendously excited. That news was terribly saddening. That book I found to be quite delicate subject material. That book was, in particular, one of my favorites. It brought me a great deal of satisfaction. There are 4 or 5 words and expressions in there that were part of the public lexicon of Frank Sinatra's time, 30s, 40s, 50s, even the 60s. But now we look at these in retrospect as bringing an aura of class, almost an illusion of sophistication to what someone says. I grew up watching many of these old vintage films, and these words like tremendously, for example, I can only hear it as ever being pronounced and enunciated as tremendously. There's a musical, melodic quality to it.
I know you broke records on the stage at the Paramount in New York recently. Do you think there were many of your early day fans in that audience?
I don't know whether there were, Ed. There might have been. But I do know that I was terribly pleased and terribly proud because, well, it had that same spontaneity and that wonderful explosive thing that took place when I originally played there.
One last comment on the way that he speaks is that there's a certain musical quality to his ordinary conversation. And I think a lot of this stems from the fact that he does have a musical background as a singer, obviously. But beyond that, I noticed that Frank does not overemphasize diction. Diction is about the enunciation, the elocution of your words. And oftentimes trying to pronounce all your T's, your D's can handicap the smoothness of your voice and tone. When he says there was an explosive quality to the reaction of the audience. I noticed that there almost was a slur in the words, but it was very smooth, it was fluid. And I think that's something we can all learn, even though we should strive to enunciate clearly. Overemphasizing can hinder us from presenting our words very smoothly. I hope you enjoyed our analysis of Frank Sinatra today. Thank you to you for gracing me with your time, and consider subscribing if you find this content of any value.